The position functions are yet another way to sort of check collisions, and some will do something when the collision happens, and others require you to set your own idea of what will happen when the collision happens. So what's more interesting about this, I've got an object ball and an object wall, and they don't do much really. Object wall, solid, but we don't really need that for this. There's a reason I'm setting its speed to 0, and we'll talk about that a little later. And now object ball, I'm setting its motion in a random direction at the speed of 6. If you don't know that, check out the motion video. And then I have different collisions, whether or not I'm colliding with certain things. So if I'm colliding with the other balls, I'm going to move bounce all, so I'm just going to bounce off of everything. And the same with the wall, it's the same code, I'm just going to bounce. You don't have to worry about this, that's for a different lesson. Now the beauty of this is I'm going to use something called a control object, or a controller object. This is an object that doesn't actually seem to take a sprite. You could give it a sprite, but then you can say not visible. And you put it in your room, and it executes certain pieces of code, but it's not actually an interactable object. It's not something that looks like it's part of the game. It's not an enemy or a wall or a character or whatever. It's just something that will control the code behind the scenes. So I have placed that in the room. Let's slide that over here. It's not a very complicated room. It's just a bunch of walls creating boundaries around the room, and then all these balls. And right there, if something doesn't have a sprite, GameMaker gives it this question mark blue ball. That, if you check down at the bottom, down here when I hover over it, it says object control position. Okay, so I've got different position functions, and the first one is position change. And let's just turn the comment off for that. Position change says changes all instances at a given position to a different object. So I've just done a conditional statement here that says if mouse check button press mouse button left. So if I click the mouse button, the left one down, just globally anywhere, then this will execute. And here's our function. This is position change. Position change needs 4 arguments. It needs an X and Y because it needs to know the position you want to look for. Then it needs to know the object you're looking for. And then it needs to know whether or not it should perform events. This means that once you change your object, the one that's going to collide with this position, to the new object, that's argument 3, so we're going to change whatever collides with my mouse X and Y into an object wall. So most of you have already followed along. If I click somewhere and an object at this position, wherever the mouse is when I'm clicking, if there's an object there, it'll turn into an object wall. Now, by the way, the balls are moving, so when I change it into an object wall, I want it to stop moving. If you remember, that's what I put in the create event of the object wall, was speed equals 0. And that leads into the 4th argument. This wants to know whether or not it should perform the create event when you change the object. And I want that to be true, because once I change the balls, which I'm going to be clicking on, into an object wall, I want the new object wall that was created to run its create event, setting its speed to 0 so it doesn't keep moving. So you can decide whether or not I could make that false if I want, or 1 and 0, whichever one you want to use. And it won't perform my create event. But here's what it looks like when I execute the code. Okay, so I got a bunch of pink balls just bouncing around, and now if you remember, if I click my mouse button, and there's something under my mouse's X and Y, it'll turn into an object wall and stop moving because of the create event that I told it to do. So there we go. Now, of course, that was at the mouse position, and you can do whatever you want. It doesn't have to be when the mouse clicks. It can be for any other reason, and it doesn't have to turn into a wall. It could turn into anything else. It could be a big wolf enemy that turns into a little bunny. It could be a square that turns into a circle for puzzle games. It doesn't matter. It's just this is a way to check a collision at a certain position and then change that object that collides into some other object. So let's comment that out so we don't do it anymore. And we'll move on to position destroy, which is even easier to understand. This destroys all of the instances that collide with a given position. For the given position, all it needs right here, position destroy, just needs an X and a Y coordinate. I've chosen halfway through the room, both at the width and height. That makes the exact center the position that I'm looking for. So that exact point, that one dot, that one pixel at 320 by 320, because my room is 640 by 640. That's halfway. If anything collides with that point, it'll be destroyed. So, I mean, you can do that for so many things, depending on what you want to do. As long as you want something to be destroyed and not based on another object, you can destroy it based on just a point in the room. And this is what does it. Pretty simple, and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so here's the room. So every time one of these pink balls crosses the center of the room, there, one just popped out of existence. It'll be right about here is the center of the room. Anytime one crosses over, it will be deleted because that's what it does. If it collides with this particular point in the room, this position, it'll be destroyed. So like I said, it's kind of a good way to just destroy certain instances without having it collide with a particular object. This just collides with a position in the room. This is similar to when something goes outside the boundaries of the room. It's the same thing. If the position equals something outside of the boundaries of the room, it gets destroyed. But in this case, it's just one particular point, one little dot. Okay, so moving on to the next one, let's just throw a little comment break on there so that it's commented out. We'll go to position empty. Returns whether a given position is empty or not. Pretty simple. It just checks if that point, that one position, the coordinate in the room, has anything overlapping it. And if not, it's considered empty. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to say not empty. So if the position is not empty, which means there is a collision, something is filling that particular spot, it's overlapping the dot in the room, and the position I'm going to look for is actually the mouse X and the mouse Y. Once again, this function only needs an X and Y, just that one point in the room. This will be a roaming point because it'll be my mouse. But what happens if something collides with my mouse? We're going to show a message that says collision at mouse, just to show you what happened. Now it's up to you to decide what you want. I mean, you could move the mouse all around the screen and destroy everything if you wanted this to be destroy the instance or whatever you want to do. But this just determines whether or not, true or false, this position is empty. So here's what it looks like. Okay, so here we go. I've hidden my mouse at the bottom right so things hopefully won't collide with it. Now, of course, this is if I collide with anything, right? So if I move over to the wall, there we go. I'll move my mouse out of the way and press enter for this. There's a collision at the mouse. Yeah, of course. That wall overlaps that one point, the X and Y of my mouse. I could do it with the pink balls as well. There we go. There was a collision at the mouse. So of course I could have replaced mouse X and mouse Y with a particular position in the room and it would have done the same thing, just whenever something overlaps it, like we did with the center of the room. So once again, you can see that position as a function is looking for specific coordinates, an X and Y value, but not necessarily another instance of an object in the room. Okay, so the last one we're going to look at, after I just turn a comment on for that so we don't execute that code, is position meeting. So this checks a position for a collision with a specific object. Now, to some this might seem very similar to other meeting codes like place meeting, but the difference is place meeting checks whether or not this instance that's calling the code is colliding with the instance you're looking for, in this case this little object right here. But with position, this instance doesn't have to be the collider. In fact, we don't want it to be. This is a control object. It doesn't even really interact with things in the room the way other objects do. It doesn't have a collision mask. There's no collision that's going to happen. So instead, this is going to check a position, once again, a coordinate, rather than place meeting, which checks if two instances, their masks overlap. So it works the same way, just we're checking a point in the room. And the point in the room I'm going to check is down here we've got X and Y again, and I'm going to check halfway through the room again, so dead center. And the object I want to check to see if it collides with this particular position is the object ball, because they're the ones moving around the room. And if an object ball happens to collide with the dead center of the room, I'm just going to show a message that says a ball is in the center of the room. So here's what it looks like. Okay, so here we go. Like right when I started up the room, a ball hit the center of the screen. So we can press enter here and clear this message, and it will probably show up multiple times as it takes a while for the ball moving at a speed of 6 to get past the center of the room. So there we go. And then when another one collides with the center of the room, whenever that happens, there we go, a ball is in the center of the room. So position meeting, like place meeting, just checks for two things colliding. But in this case, one of the things isn't another object in the room. It's a point in the room, one particular coordinate. So that's kind of the difference between things like place and position. Position is always looking for a particular coordinate. You can assign that coordinate to an object if you wanted to, the way I did it with mouse X and mouse Y, but it gives you the freedom to choose any spot or any coordinate in the room. The differences may be minimal, but it's something that gives you a little more control over what you're trying to do with your game. So I hope you've learned some things about the position functions and maybe come up with some ideas on how to use them in your game.